Welcome to the Explainer. When you look at a beautiful green forest, what do you usually see? A peaceful scenery, maybe a quiet escape? Well, prepare to have your mind totally changed. Today, we're looking at the forests of South Korea's Jeju Island, and we're going to see that forests aren't just passive scenery. They are highly dynamic, strategic, and honestly, often ruthless battlegrounds. We're going to explore exactly how trees fight the wind, manipulate insects, and literally build the ground beneath them just to survive. There's this fantastic quote that perfectly challenges how we look at trees. It says, "The coastal forest is not a forest of trees standing alone, but trees surviving between each other's bodies." We almost always think of a tree as this independent, solitary giant, right? But out on the harsh, windy coasts of Jeju, independence is basically a death sentence. To survive out here, plants have to lean on each other, share the massive burden of the environment, and cooperate in ways that are absolutely mind-blowing. So let's jump right into Section 1, Survival on the Edge. We're starting at the absolute front line, the incredibly hostile, windy, and salty coastal edges. Honestly, if you were standing out here during a coastal storm, you'd think there is no way a delicate plant could survive. But life always finds a way, doesn't it? To conquer this environment, two pioneer plants out here have absolute superpowers. First up, the vitex plant. Instead of growing tall and fighting that wind, it just creeps low right along the sand. It literally refuses to give the wind a target. Then there's the Elaeagnus. It doesn't crawl on the ground, but it also doesn't stand totally on its own. It leans flexibly on other plants, using them as structural support. And the craziest part? It actually thrives in dead, salty sand by making its own food. Okay, let me explain exactly how it pulls that off. It uses something called nitrogen fixation. Basically, it's this magical process where a plant uses symbiotic root bacteria, like Frankia, to convert atmospheric nitrogen directly into usable fertilizer. Think about that for a second. This little Elaeagnus is acting as a magical soil builder. By teaming up with these microbes, it's literally pulling fertilizer out of thin air, feeding itself and dropping nutrient-rich leaves that fertilize the barren sand. It's essentially terraforming the beach so that other, less hardy plants can eventually move in. Moving on to Section 2, Mastering the Wind. So, moving just a bit further inland, how do the frontline trees that do stand up handle those relentless coastal winds without just snapping in half? Well, standard deciduous trees usually fight back. They create something called tension wood on the top of their branches, basically trying to violently pull themselves back upright against the force. It's a constant struggle. But Jeju's Viburnum awabuki tree takes a totally different approach. Instead of fighting the wind directly, it uses its internal muscles to create compression wood beneath the branch. It adjusts itself to find a perfect, resilient balance, stabilizing in a bent position. It accepts the wind and finds harmony with it. Pretty smart, right? All right, let's get into Section 3, Secrets on the Leaves. Let's zoom way in here, past the heavy wooden branches down to the microscopic world on the leaves themselves. Because out here, the battle isn't just against the wind, it's about water, salt, and forming these tiny, adorable little alliances. First, we've got to understand a concept called lucidophile. This refers to a forest of evergreen broadleaf trees that have incredibly thick, glossy, light-reflecting leaves. If you look at the Jeju canopy, it literally shines in the sun. These waxy leaves act like shiny little shields. They reflect the intense summer sunlight so the tree doesn't overheat, and those thick layers protect the trees from extreme water loss and the corrosive, salty air blowing in off the ocean. And some trees take this shielding to the absolute next level. The Elaeagnus, which we talked about earlier, has leaves completely covered in microscopic overlapping scales called trichomes. If you flip one of these leaves over, the bottom is bright silver. This silver belly acts as a microscopic suit of armor against those brutal coastal elements. It reflects light, traps a tiny layer of moisture so it doesn't dry out, and physically blocks salt particles from touching the actual plant tissue. But, defense isn't always just about physical shields. Sometimes you need an army. And that brings us to domatia. These are tiny pockets, tufts of hair, or little galls on a leaf that serve as built-in homes for helpful insects or predatory mites. That's right, these trees are intentionally inviting specific, tiny bugs to live directly on their bodies. It is literally a 1 millimeter bug hotel. Trees like the Distilium grow these tiny round galls, transforming their leaves into safe, multi-generational homes for tiny, helpful aphids. The plant sacrifices just a tiny bit of its leaf tissue to create the bumps, and in return, the bugs might provide nutrients through their waste, or their presence might attract larger predators that keep the really bad leaf-eating pests away. The tree turns what looks like a tiny insect infestation into a mutually beneficial housing complex. It's a whole microscopic neighborhood built right onto the leaf. Which brings us to Section 4, the fragile forest boundary. Now, pulling back from the micro world of bug hotels to the macro level, we're going to explore the deep cultural and climatic realities of this forest boundary. You really can't talk about Jeju without talking about gereombi. This is a local Jeju term that actually refers to two things: a deeply scarred historical rocky coast and the incredibly resilient Nilatia tree that grows there. These trees grow in the exact same harsh, rocky terrain. They hold the deep cultural memory of Jeju. The people there relate to this tree because, just like them, it survives and thrives on the very edge of the island, deeply rooted in the physical and emotional heartbeat of the land.
So, how does this boundary forest actually expand? Well, the crucial point here is that these forests don't just grow outward on their own. They are actively planted and expanded by an army of feathered couriers. Birds, like the brown-eared bulbul, eat the small fruits. The seeds easily survive the bird's digestion process. Then, as the birds fly out to the empty, sunny, super harsh edges of the forest boundary, their droppings effectively plant new trees, complete with a little starter pack of fertilizer. The birds are truly the architects of the forest edge.
To really build a picture of deep time here, we have to ask, how did these tropical broadleaf trees even get to Jeju in the first place? Well, 20,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, sea levels were so low that land bridges connected Jeju all the way south to Taiwan. Around 12,000 years ago, as the climate warmed up, these warm climate forests literally migrated north along the land. And then, 10,000 years ago, sea levels rose, trapping these tropical relics right here on Jeju. They literally walked here from the tropics during the Ice Age. How incredible is that? But because they are relics from a totally different climate, they exist on a razor's edge. A forest isn't just a collection of wood and leaves, It's a highly fragile balance of very specific conditions. We're talking soil moisture, wind patterns, insect balance, temperature, and of course, human impact. They all play a massive part. If any single one of these elements gets thrown out of proportion, the forest doesn't just slowly adapt, it collapses. And that brings us to the tragic climax of our explainer. Just off the coast of Jeju is Munsam Island, which is home to the once majestic Elaeagnus trees. These upper canopy giants require a very specific, humid, stable environment to survive. But human foot traffic altered the wind flows. That altered the moisture levels, which then allowed a devastating insect-borne bacteria to take hold. Today, these beautiful trees are facing sudden and catastrophic collapse. 80%. I really want you to take in that stark, devastating statistic. 80% of the upper canopy trees on Munsam Island are already dead or dying. This isn't just a slow decline, it is a structural collapse of an entire ecosystem. Because the underlying conditions were broken, the ancient trees that relied on that exact fragile balance simply could not survive. The forest doesn't just disappear on its own, right? The invisible conditions that support it break first. These trees on Jeju survived ice ages, violent storms, and salty winds because they adapted to the precise conditions around them. But when the climate changes too fast and that balance shatters, even the strongest giants fall. It leaves us with a pretty haunting question. As our own global climate shifts, are we maintaining the conditions for our own survival?